In the chronicles of Rome's long history, few names cast such a dark shadow as Tiberius Caesar Augustus, the second emperor of the mighty Roman Empire. He was once hailed as a disciplined commander, a man of order, a soldier who defended the empire's frontiers. But behind that stern exterior, there lurked something far more sinister. The transformation of Tiberius from a cautious ruler into one of history's most feared emperors is a tale that blends tragedy, paranoia, and monstrous cruelty. Tonight, we are going to step inside that world. A world where absolute power did not simply corrupt. It created something far more terrifying. A ruler who treated the lives of his subjects as playthings, and whose appetites knew no boundaries. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching this from. When Tiberius ascended the throne in 14 AD, many Romans felt relief. He was the adopted son of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and a man who had brought decades of civil war to an end. To the people, Tiberius seemed like the right man to continue that legacy. He was an accomplished general who had proven his skill in Germania, securing the empire's northern borders and bringing stability to territories that had always been difficult to control. He was not a man who craved the spotlight like Julius Caesar or Augustus before him. Instead, he was reserved, stern, almost reluctant to wear the purple robes of imperial power. At first, Rome saw this as a virtue, a man not blinded by vanity, but by duty. Yet the seeds of something darker were already buried deep within him. His early life was marked by personal losses and humiliations that shaped the man he would become. He had been forced to divorce his first wife, whom he loved deeply, only to marry Julia, the daughter of Augustus. Julia was notorious for her scandals and promiscuity, and the marriage was a disaster. Tiberius endured it not out of affection, but because Augustus demanded it. To a man already prone to bitterness, this felt like betrayal. Then came the death of his younger brother Drusus, the person closest to him. These wounds didn't heal. They festered, creating cracks in his character that power would later rip wide open. For the first 10 years of his reign, however, Tiberius played the role of a competent emperor. He upheld Augustus' policies, kept the empire financially stable, avoided unnecessary wars, and even showed deference to the Senate. Many believed Rome had entered a steady period of calm under his rule. But beneath that calm exterior, Tiberius was changing. His bitterness grew, and those closest to him began to notice a man withdrawing into cynicism and suspicion. The breaking point came in 23 AD, when his beloved son, Drusus the Younger, died, possibly poisoned by rivals. For Tiberius, this was more than grief. It was confirmation that betrayal was everywhere, that no one could be trusted, not even his family. After this loss, the emperor began to withdraw from public life. The general who had once led legions with confidence now shrank from the people he ruled. By 26 AD, he made the fateful decision that would define the rest of his reign. He abandoned Rome entirely and retreated to the island of Capri, off the coast of Naples. Officially, he claimed this was for rest, a retreat from the endless pressures of governing the world's largest empire. But Capri was no simple refuge. It became his fortress, his prison, and most disturbingly, his playground for desires that shocked even the Romans, who were no strangers to decadence. Capri's dramatic cliffs, secluded location, and breathtaking views hid something far more grotesque. Tiberius constructed 12 villas across the island, each one lavish, each one secretive, and each one whispered about in terror by servants. The empire was no longer ruled from the Senate in Rome, but from Capri, where letters sealed with the emperor's orders meant life or death for senators, generals, and citizens alike. Visitors to Capri often returned with haunted looks in their eyes, if they returned at all. At the center of Tiberius's inner circle was an astrologer named Thrasyllus, a figure who fed the emperor's paranoia with endless predictions of plots, betrayals, and assassinations. Under his influence, Tiberius came to see every senator as a possible conspirator, every friend as a potential enemy. The empire was being run by a man who lived in isolation, consumed by fear, and who unleashed that fear in the most horrific ways imaginable. But what truly separated Tiberius from other cruel rulers was not just his paranoia or his political ruthlessness. It was the perverse creativity with which he indulged his desires. Ancient historians like Suetonius describe scenes that are almost too disturbing to believe. At Capri, children, both boys and girls, were brought under the guise of serving the emperor. They were trained in grotesque games. Some were taught to swim between his legs in his private pools, touching and caressing him in acts so disturbing that even hardened Romans shuddered to hear about them. These children were nicknamed minnows, and the horror of their existence still echoes through history. But the games did not end at the water's edge. Tiberius ordered theatrical performances where young people were forced to engage in sexual acts before him, sometimes in groups of 3, which he coldly referred to as chains. His villas were decorated with erotic art and scrolls imported from across the empire, turning his chambers into halls of perversion where nothing was forbidden and nothing was too extreme. Even those who had grown used to Roman indulgence were appalled at the creativity with which Tiberius explored depravity. One of the most chilling aspects of his reign was the creation of the spintrace, a word that became synonymous with unspeakable acts. These were children trained from the moment they were taken, their entire lives shaped around one purpose: to serve the emperor's increasingly twisted demands. Some were taught acts so vile that the Latin language itself had no words to describe them. Their lives had no future, no escape. Many died in service to Tiberius, and those who survived were often murdered, silenced forever so that no story could leave Capri. But the horror spread far beyond the emperor's own pleasures. Tiberius needed enablers, and he found them in Rome's nobility, men who were willing to sacrifice their own morality, even their families, to stay in his good graces. Some offered their own children or siblings to him in exchange for favors. Others became procurers, scouring the empire for new victims to satisfy the emperor's endless hunger. An entire economy of exploitation developed around Capri. Human lives became currency, and survival often meant participating in this nightmare. The whispers of Capri spread quickly across Rome. Tales emerged of noble virgins forced into twisted ceremonies, of infants still nursing being abused, of victims thrown from the island's cliffs once the emperor had tired of them. Soldiers were stationed below the cliffs to make sure none survived the fall. To many Romans, it no longer mattered whether every detail was true. What mattered was that the emperor was capable of such acts, and the fear alone was enough to shatter the soul of the empire. The horror of Tiberius's rule was not confined to the villas of Capri. His paranoia poisoned every corner of the Roman world. In Rome itself, life was gripped by an invisible terror. Senators, once proud and defiant in the days of the Republic, became shadows of themselves. They smiled, they praised, they obeyed, because the smallest misstep could mean ruin. Tiberius no longer needed armies to crush his enemies. Fear itself became his most effective weapon. The emperor had perfected the art of psychological torture. He would summon senators with warm invitations, only to have them executed at the moment they believed they had been spared. He would allow condemned men to think they had received mercy, then order their deaths days later. Parents were sometimes forced to witness the execution of their own children. In other cases, the reverse occurred. Children were forced to watch their mothers or fathers put to death. Every cruelty was justified by Tiberius as a test of loyalty, but deep down, he seemed to take delight in suffering for its own sake. The treason trials became his favorite tool of control. Almost anything could be twisted into a crime against the emperor. A careless word, a poorly timed joke, Even the wrong expression on one's face could be interpreted as treason. Professional informers, known as delators, sprang up like weeds. These men made fortunes by accusing others of disloyalty. If their accusations stuck, they shared in the confiscated wealth of the condemned. In this twisted system, accusing someone became a profitable business. Friend betrayed friend, families were ripped apart, and trust evaporated in Roman society. It wasn't long before suspicion spread like wildfire. People feared speaking openly at dinner tables. Writers burned their works, poets fell silent, and even private conversations were whispered with caution. Parents told their children not to talk in their sleep, for fear that even their dreams might betray them. Rome, once known for its lively debates and spirited discourse, was silenced under a blanket of dread. Meanwhile, Tiberius grew more grotesque in both body and mind. Ancient sources describe his face as ravaged by sores and covered with thick ointments to conceal the decay. He wore wigs to hide his baldness and smeared heavy makeup across his skin. The once proud general now resembled a ghoul, hiding away on Capri, surrounded by guards even when he slept. His paranoia ran so deep that he would sometimes test his meals on condemned prisoners before touching them himself. Yet despite his isolation, Tiberius's shadow loomed over Rome. He ruled through correspondence, each letter he sent dripping with either punishment or execution orders. His silence was just as deadly, for when he refused to reply, those awaiting judgment often killed themselves rather than face the uncertainty of his wrath. Rome had become an empire ruled by absence, by a ghost emperor who governed through terror from a distant island fortress. One man who thrived under Tiberius's paranoia was Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the ambitious commander of the Praetorian Guard. 4 years, Sejanus acted as the emperor's right hand, consolidating power in Rome while Tiberius indulged in isolation. Sejanus manipulated treason trials to eliminate rivals and filled key positions with his own supporters. For a time, he seemed untouchable, a man who ruled Rome in everything but name. But Tiberius trusted no one for long. In 31 AD, he turned on his prefect with shocking speed. Sejanus was arrested, condemned, and executed, his body dragged through the streets. What followed was a wave of purges even more terrifying than before. Anyone who had supported or even spoken favorably of Sejanus was hunted down. Entire families were wiped out. Children were not spared. Roman law had once protected minors from execution, but Tiberius shattered that precedent. In one infamous case, a young virgin condemned to death was raped by her executioner, because Roman law forbade killing virgins. Such was the cruelty of this new order. The years that followed marked the height of Rome's nightmare. Tiberius's cruelty intensified as his physical desires began to wane. What he lost in lust, he replaced with sadism. Torture became more creative, more elaborate. Victims were forced to drink enormous amounts of wine, their genitals tied with cords until the pain became unbearable. He turned executions into spectacles of humiliation, breaking not just bodies but spirits. Even in their deaths, people were made to serve his twisted sense of power. The Senate became a theater of obedience. Once a body of proud statesmen, it now resembled a pack of desperate survivors competing to outpraise their master. They proposed new honors for Tiberius with grotesque enthusiasm, hoping that flattery might save them. They condemned colleagues on the flimsiest of evidence, knowing that showing mercy might brand them as traitors. Some could not endure the shame and chose suicide, hoping that at least in death their families might keep some shred of dignity. Even the law itself became an instrument of madness. Old statutes were resurrected and reinterpreted until no one could know what was safe. One man was executed for bringing a coin with Tiberius's image into a brothel. Another was condemned for criticizing a youthful poem the emperor had written decades earlier. Even consulting soothsayers about the emperor's health could be punished by death. The charge of maestas, injury to the majesty of the Roman people, was stretched so broadly that almost anything could be twisted into guilt. The Roman people, crushed under the weight of fear, whispered stories of Capri that grew darker with each telling. Parents frightened their children into obedience with tales of Tiberius, the monster on the island. Graffiti cursing his name appeared on walls, though writing it was a crime punishable by death. Even Rome's religious life was tainted. Ceremonies that had once honored the gods were twisted into grotesque rituals for the emperor's amusement. Some believed that the disasters striking Rome, fires, floods, earthquakes, were signs of divine anger at his crimes. Economically, the empire suffered. The confiscations from treason trials enriched the imperial treasury but destroyed confidence. Wealthy families hid their money or spent it quickly, fearing it would be seized. Investment collapsed. Creativity withered. The poets and historians who had once flourished under Augustus fell silent. Artists turned either to bland, meaningless subjects or descended into pornography, catering to the emperor's tastes. Architecture itself reflected the change. Where Augustus had built temples, Tiberius raised pleasure palaces and chambers of torment. Even Rome's proudest institution, the military, was not spared. Promotions were no longer won by bravery on the battlefield, but by loyalty to the emperor, or by supplying him with victims. Soldiers of the Praetorian Guard became enforcers of terror, throwing children from cliffs, torturing senators, and silencing dissent. The legions at the borders remained effective by sheer inertia, but the warrior spirit that had once conquered the Mediterranean was slowly rotting from within. What makes Tiberius's story so chilling is that Rome itself did not collapse during these years. Taxes were collected, roads maintained, borders defended. To the outside world, the empire still functioned. But at its heart, a moral rot was spreading that no legion could defeat. The Rome that prided itself on law, honor, and virtue was being hollowed out from within. Tiberius had become not just a ruler, but a sickness at the core of the empire. His personal madness had fused with the machinery of the state. What had once been private vice had become public policy. And Rome, trapped in fear, paralyzed by paranoia, allowed it to continue. By the time Tiberius entered his final decade as emperor, the man who had once marched at the head of legions was no longer recognizable. He was a husk, ravaged by disease, consumed by paranoia, and trapped in the fortress he had built for himself on Capri. Ancient sources describe him as grotesque, his skin pitted with sores, his body weakened by age and vice, his face caked with ointments and powders that could not hide his decay. His appearance matched his soul, both corrupted beyond recognition. Yet despite his condition, his cruelty only sharpened. Where once his appetites focused on perverse pleasures, now they centered on inflicting pain. He seemed to find comfort in watching others suffer, in knowing that his power could destroy lives at a whim. Some historians believe that by this stage, Tiberius no longer distinguished between governance and sadism. To rule, for him, was to torture. The empire remained in the grip of fear. Rome itself functioned like a body held together by instinct, even as its heart was poisoned. Taxes were still collected, soldiers still drilled, trade still flowed across the Mediterranean. But beneath that surface, trust and vitality had vanished. Families no longer dared to celebrate too openly. Success itself became dangerous, for to be noticed was to risk envy, accusation, or death. The intellectual life of Rome, once the pride of the empire, withered. Poets no longer sang of heroes or gods, but confined themselves to safe, empty verses. Historians turned to ancient tales rather than risk commenting on the present. Writers burned their manuscripts rather than allow dangerous words to be used as evidence against them. Even philosophy, the great refuge of troubled minds, bent under the weight of fear. The Stoics who preached virtue in the face of tyranny were silenced, or worse, condemned for treason themselves. Meanwhile, Capri grew into a symbol of everything rotten. To the outside eye, it was a paradise of marble villas and breathtaking views. But beneath that beauty lurked a nightmare. Stories of the emperor's twisted entertainments spread through whispers and graffiti. Children forced into roles as playthings. Young men and women stripped of dignity in staged spectacles. Bodies thrown from cliffs as casually as one might discard trash. Whether every detail was true mattered less than the fact that everyone believed them. Rome had come to see its ruler as a monster, and fear did the rest. The people's hatred grew stronger with each passing year, but it was a hatred without an outlet. The Praetorian Guard stood ready to silence dissent. Informers thrived. The Senate bent its knee daily. Tiberius had created a system where cruelty perpetuated itself, where even those who despised him had to participate in his crimes in order to survive. Every senator who condemned a colleague, every procurer who delivered a child to Capri, every guard who carried out an execution, all became pieces of the emperor's machinery of horror. When Sejanus was destroyed, many believed it was the end of tyranny. Instead, it was only the beginning of a darker phase. The purges that followed reached new levels of brutality. Families were executed not just for treason, but for association with treason. Sons and daughters of the accused were slain alongside their parents. Some were tortured in public as warnings. In one infamous case, a girl condemned by the Senate was raped by her executioner before being put to death, because Roman law forbade killing virgins. In Tiberius's Rome, even the law's protections were twisted into excuses for greater cruelty. The emperor himself rarely set foot on the mainland. When he did, his visits resembled the progress of a plague. Communities hid their young, concealed their daughters, and prayed that he would leave quickly. His approach inspired not celebration but dread. The man who had once been Rome's general now resembled something closer to a curse. And yet, through it all, Rome endured. The empire's vast machinery, its provinces, its armies, its roads and markets, was too large to collapse at once. Foreign ambassadors still came, though they trembled at the idea of approaching Capri. Allied kings kept their children in Rome as hostages, knowing what happened to those who displeased the emperor. Rome's enemies watched in astonishment as the empire consumed itself in paranoia and corruption. And still, the borders held. This paradox haunts historians. How could an empire so sick at its core continue to function? Perhaps it was because Tiberius, despite his depravity, never lost his administrative instincts. He remained frugal with the treasury, cautious in foreign wars, and careful to preserve Rome's infrastructure. It was as though two men lived inside him, the disciplined general who had once served Augustus, and the sadistic monster who ruled from Capri. The people got both, and they paid the price. But for the victims, there was no paradox. There was only suffering. Thousands were executed during the treason trials. Thousands more vanished into Capri, never to be seen again. Entire family lines of Rome's nobility were extinguished, their wealth confiscated, their memory destroyed. For those who survived, life was marked by silence, by the memory of betrayals, by the guilt of complicity. Parents who offered their children to the emperor lived with shame. Senators who condemned friends lived with regret. Rome itself seemed to carry a scar that no victory could erase. As Tiberius aged into his 70s, his obsession with death became overwhelming. He feared it constantly, yet seemed to court it with reckless behavior. He demanded daily readings from astrologers, desperate to know when his end would come. He executed those who predicted it too soon. He tested food, surrounded himself with guards, and distrusted even those closest to him. Yet he also ignored his failing health, as though daring fate to strike. The paradox of his reign reached its climax here. The emperor who terrified millions lived in terror himself, trapped by shadows he had conjured. In 37 AD, the inevitable came. Tiberius fell gravely ill during a journey on the mainland. At first, news spread that he was dead, and Rome prepared to rejoice. But when he suddenly revived, panic rippled through the court. According to some sources, it was his successor, Caligula, or the Praetorian prefect Macro, who finally smothered him to ensure that the old monster would not rise again. Others insist he died naturally, alone and unrepentant. Either way, the man who had ruled Rome for 23 years, nearly half of them from his island prison, was finally gone. The reaction in Rome was unlike anything seen before. When Augustus had died, the city had mourned as if losing a father. But when Tiberius's death was announced, the people erupted in joy. They demanded his body be thrown into the Tiber River like a criminal's. They shouted curses, sang songs, and celebrated the end of an era of fear. The Senate debated whether to even grant him the honors of an emperor's funeral. Only the pressure of his successor ensured that he was buried with formality. But there was no grief, no genuine sorrow, only relief. Tiberius died hated, despised, and feared. He left behind not glory, not triumphs, but scars. His reign had shown Romans that their emperor could be more than incompetent. He could be a monster. The Principate, designed by Augustus to preserve order, had revealed its dark side. It could concentrate power so completely that one man's madness could poison an entire empire. Rome would never forget the lesson. The death of Tiberius may have ended his personal reign of terror, but it did not erase the scars he left on Rome. The city had survived him, yes, but survival was not the same as healing. His shadow lingered like a stain, and the precedents he set continued to poison the empire long after his body was laid to rest. For the Senate, the trauma was profound. This was once the proud body that had debated war and peace, that had stood against Hannibal, that had overseen the transformation of Rome from republic to empire. But under Tiberius, it had been reduced to a collection of frightened men competing in flattery and betrayal. Senators who had condemned their own colleagues could never reclaim their honor. Others who had remained silent lived with the shame of their cowardice. Even after his death, the Senate could not fully recover its dignity. The memory of groveling before a tyrant had broken something in the institution forever. For the Roman people, Tiberius became a kind of legend, a warning. Parents told their children stories of the monster of Capri, the emperor who devoured the innocence of boys and girls, who murdered without reason, who treated life itself as a game. His name became shorthand for cruelty and depravity. Even generations later, graffiti appeared comparing new tyrants to Tiberius. His reign had reshaped the imagination of Rome. But the damage was not just political or cultural, it was also spiritual. Rome had always believed in the favor of its gods, in the protection of divine forces that rewarded virtue and punished wickedness. Yet Tiberius had prospered for 23 years, committing unspeakable acts, desecrating sacred ceremonies, mocking the very idea of piety. The gods had not struck him down. This contradiction shook the faith of many. Earthquakes, fires, and floods that occurred during his reign were widely interpreted as divine wrath, punishment for the emperor's sins. And yet he lived year after year, while the innocent perished. For many Romans, this broke their belief in divine justice. If the gods could allow such evil to flourish, perhaps the gods themselves had abandoned Rome. This spiritual crisis opened the door for new ideas. Mystery religions from the East, which promised salvation and hope in the afterlife, began to attract followers. Stoic philosophy gained strength among those who sought refuge in virtue and inner strength, rather than in the corrupt world of politics. And not long after, a new faith would rise from the provinces, Christianity, offering a moral clarity that condemned the very evils Tiberius embodied. In a strange way, his reign helped prepare the ground for Rome's eventual spiritual transformation. The economic impact of his terror was equally corrosive. Confiscations filled the treasury but strangled investment. Families hid their wealth, fearing it might be seized. Merchants traded cautiously, wary of attracting imperial attention. An entire parasitic economy grew around the system of informers, feeding off destruction rather than creation. Even Capri, with its lavish villas and endless stream of victims, drained resources that could have built aqueducts, roads, or marketplaces for the people. Rome was wealthy enough to endure this waste, but the opportunity cost was enormous. Beyond Rome, foreign allies and enemies alike watched in disbelief. Ambassadors waited for years before being granted an audience, never knowing if they would return alive. Kings who once proudly allied with Rome found their children held as hostages, pawns in the emperor's paranoia. The great rival power in the east, Parthia, observed Rome's inward decay with amazement. Even barbarian tribes along the frontiers began to wonder if Rome's claim to civilization was nothing more than organized brutality. Tiberius had undermined not just Rome's government, but its moral authority in the world. The cultural life of the empire, once vibrant, sank into silence. The great poets of Augustus' golden age were gone, replaced by mediocrity or by writers too afraid to speak the truth. The arts turned either to bland mythological subjects or to obscene works catering to imperial tastes. Architecture reflected the emperor's obsessions, not with temples or public works, but with villas of pleasure and fortresses of fear. Medicine stagnated as physicians devoted themselves not to advancing knowledge, but to concocting ointments and aphrodisiacs for the emperor's diseased body. Science itself bent to superstition, with astrologers enjoying more influence than astronomers or philosophers. Rome's brilliance had dimmed under the weight of terror. The role of women during this period presents its own chapter of tragedy. Noble matrons who had once commanded respect were reduced to bargaining chips. Mothers offered their daughters to the emperor in the desperate hope of survival. Wives of condemned men were executed or enslaved, their children scattered to the winds. Even priestesses, once considered sacred, were not spared. The sanctity of marriage, the dignity of motherhood, values once respected in Roman society, meant nothing in the face of imperial lust. The military, too, bore the mark of corruption. Soldiers who had once dreamed of glory on the frontiers were reduced to enforcers of terror in Rome. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect the emperor, became instruments of fear against his own citizens. Promotions were granted not for courage in battle, but for loyalty to Tiberius's twisted desires or for supplying him with victims. Though the legions on the borders remained strong, the spirit that had once conquered the Mediterranean world was quietly rotting away. Perhaps most chilling was the corruption of Roman law. The empire had once prided itself on its legal system, a system that would later influence all of Western civilization. But under Tiberius, law became nothing more than a weapon of fear. Trials were charades. Accusations meant death. Advocates who defended their clients too vigorously risked joining them in execution. Even the dead were not safe. Tiberius prosecuted men posthumously, confiscating their estates and erasing their memorials. The very concept of justice became a mockery. The psychological toll on Roman society was immense. Trust collapsed. Friends became potential informers. Families betrayed one another to survive. People learned to smile when they wanted to scream, to flatter when they wanted to curse, to hide their true thoughts even from themselves. Rome had become a society of masks, where survival meant silence. And yet, through all this darkness, a strange paradox remained. Tiberius had once been capable, even competent. He had begun as a disciplined general and administrator, a man who avoided unnecessary wars and guarded the empire's resources carefully. This makes his descent into monstrosity all the more terrifying. Was it absolute power that corrupted him? Was it madness brought on by tragedy, disease, or even lead poisoning from Roman pipes and wine? Or was the monster always there, hidden beneath the armor of the general, waiting for the opportunity to emerge? Modern psychology might label him with sadistic disorders, paranoia, even schizophrenia. But clinical terms cannot capture the reality of what he became. Tiberius was more than a man with illnesses. He was a man who chose cruelty, who embraced depravity, and who used the full machinery of an empire to indulge it. He stands as proof of what happens when power is unchecked, when one man's darkness becomes the law of the land. And while he eventually died, despised and unloved, the system he corrupted did not die with him. Rome would endure, but the wound he left behind would never fully heal. The years after Tiberius's death revealed the true scale of the damage he had done to Rome. His body was gone, but the systems he built, the fear, the betrayals, the normalization of cruelty, remained like poison in the empire's bloodstream. When the news of his death first reached Rome, the people erupted in joy. They shouted to cast his corpse into the Tiber River, as if drowning it in muddy waters could wash away 23 years of trauma. But no river was deep enough to cleanse the stain he left on Rome's soul. The Senate, freed from his terror, debated whether to even grant him the honors of an emperor's funeral. Many senators wanted nothing more than to see his memory erased, his name cursed forever. Only the intervention of his successor, Caligula, ensured that Tiberius was buried with the rituals befitting an emperor. Yet even this ceremony was hollow, performed without genuine mourning. The city had mourned Augustus like a father. For Tiberius, there was no grief, only relief. But Rome could not simply move on. The wounds of Capri lingered. The children taken from families, trained into monsters of servitude, disappeared into silence. The senators who had condemned friends and neighbors carried their guilt to their graves. Parents who had offered their children to the emperor to save themselves lived with shame. Thousands had died in treason trials, their estates seized, their names disgraced. Even those who survived were marked by the memory of betrayal, by the weight of complicity. Rome itself was scarred, a society traumatized by the knowledge of what it had allowed to happen. The very foundations of Roman society had been shaken. The law, once the pride of Rome, had been twisted into a weapon of terror. The Senate, once the center of debate, had become a stage for cowardice. The military, once a symbol of Roman discipline, had been corrupted into a tool of fear. Even religion had been stained by blasphemy. Tiberius had shown Romans that their emperor could be not just incompetent or cruel, but truly evil. That knowledge could never be unlearned, and it set a precedent. The treason trials, the employment of informers, the confusion of private vice with public policy, these tools would be revived by later emperors. Tiberius had shown how power could be used to bend every institution, every law, every tradition into a weapon for one man's will. Once that boundary had been crossed, it could never fully be restored. For the victims, there was no justice. The children abused on Capri, the families destroyed in Rome, the innocents executed on false charges. None of them would be avenged. Their names were forgotten, their suffering reduced to whispers in the histories of Tacitus and Suetonius. They were reduced to statistics in the chronicles of tyranny. But behind every number was a face, a life cut short, a story lost forever. The silence of their absence haunted Rome long after Tiberius's death. Even the physical remnants of his reign carried the taint of corruption. The villas on Capri stood abandoned for years, shunned as cursed places. Later emperors occasionally visited, but never stayed long, as though the very stones retained the memory of horror. Archaeologists in modern times have uncovered fragments of these villas, reminders of their grandeur but not of their atrocities. Perhaps it is a mercy that no direct evidence of what happened there survives. Some secrets are too monstrous to face. What fascinates and horrifies historians is the paradox of Tiberius. He was not a Nero, obsessed with theatrical self-destruction. He was not a Caligula, reveling in open madness. He was something colder, more methodical. He had been a competent general, a disciplined administrator, a man who could govern with stability when he chose to, and yet he twisted that very competence into a tool of depravity. He used the machinery of empire not for glory or expansion, but for pleasure and cruelty. His reign was not chaos, it was horror disguised as order. This makes him unique in the gallery of tyrants. Where others destroyed through recklessness, Tiberius destroyed through calculation. He institutionalized depravity, making the abuse of children and the murder of innocents into state functions. His private vices became public policy. His paranoia became law, and Rome obeyed. Modern comparisons are difficult. The 20th century produced its share of monsters, but most cloaked their crimes in ideology or nationalism. Tiberius had no such disguise. He tortured and abused not for Rome, not for conquest, not for faith, but for himself. His evil was personal, stripped of justification, and that makes it all the more chilling. What is perhaps most disturbing is how easily Rome adapted. Ordinary people learned to live under tyranny. Merchants continued to trade. Farmers continued to plant. Life went on, even as neighbors vanished into the emperor's prisons, even as families were destroyed. People learned to smile when they wanted to scream, to flatter when they wanted to curse. Civilization adjusted to monstrosity, and in that adjustment lies the deepest horror of all, that human beings can endure almost anything, even the rule of a monster. Some Romans resisted in small ways. Graffiti cursing the emperor's name appeared on walls, though the authors risked death. Poets hid subversive meanings in their verses, cloaked in allegory. Families quietly honored the memory of the condemned, but there was no great rebellion, no uprising against the tyrant. Fear crushed resistance before it could begin. Tiberius had built a system so suffocating that opposition seemed impossible. The people endured because they had no other choice. And when he finally died, Rome breathed again. But the breathing was shallow, cautious. The people knew that another emperor could rise at any moment, another Tiberius in a different form. And indeed, they were right. His successor, Caligula, would show that madness was not unique to one man. The Principate, the system Augustus had designed to prevent civil war, was now revealed as capable of producing monsters worse than war itself. Rome had entered a new age, an age where the character of one man could decide the fate of millions. 4 centuries afterward, Tiberius's name remained a byword for cruelty. Writers could not describe depravity without invoking Capri. Parents frightened their children with his ghost. Even emperors who followed were measured against him. Was this ruler as bad as Tiberius? Did his cruelty rival the monster of Capri? His reign became the standard of evil. But the deeper lesson was about Rome itself. The empire had tolerated him for 23 years. Fear, habit, and the promise of stability had kept the people silent. The Senate had surrendered its dignity. The guard had enforced his will. The nobles had supplied his victims. The evil of one man could not have flourished without the cooperation of many. And in that cooperation lay the true horror. The reign of Tiberius left a lesson carved into Roman memory, that evil on such a scale could not exist in isolation. It required a system, a network of enablers, a web of ordinary men and women who chose silence, complicity, or profit over resistance. Each guard who threw a child from Capri's cliffs, each senator who voted to condemn an innocent colleague, each informer who profited from an accusation, they were all part of the machinery. Tiberius may have been the architect, but it was society that built the walls of terror around itself. This is why his death, though celebrated, did not bring true closure. Rome had looked into the mirror and seen what it was capable of tolerating. It could no longer pretend that tyranny was an aberration. Tyranny had become a possibility built into the very system. The Principate, which Augustus had designed to preserve peace, had revealed its dark potential. By concentrating so much power in one man's hands, Rome had left itself vulnerable. If that man was wise, the empire could flourish. If he was cruel, the empire itself became an instrument of cruelty. And Tiberius was not the last. His successor, Caligula, would demonstrate that imperial madness was not an exception. The machinery of power remained intact, ready to be used again. The Senate, already broken, lacked the courage to resist. The Praetorian Guard, accustomed to enforcing terror, continued its role. The people, trained to obey, would obey again. The age of tyrants had begun, yet Tiberius's uniqueness remained. Later emperors would indulge in cruelty or excess, but few fused their personal depravity with state power so completely. Nero would burn Rome and revel in theatrical decadence, but his cruelties often seemed like performances. Caligula would commit atrocities, but his reign was short and chaotic. Tiberius, by contrast, sustained his horror for decades, turning cruelty into policy, perversion into governance. His reign was not a brief madness. It was a long, deliberate descent into darkness. The psychological toll of those years cannot be overstated. A generation of Romans grew up knowing nothing but fear. They learned to survive by keeping silent, by hiding their thoughts, by distrusting even their families. Conversations were weighed before being spoken. Smiles were masks. Courage became dangerous. This culture of suspicion outlived Tiberius, shaping Roman society for decades. Even under better emperors, the scars remained. The intellectual silence of the era speaks volumes. Historians who lived under Tiberius rarely dared to record events. Only later, when the danger had passed, did men like Tacitus and Suetonius gather the stories, piecing together a narrative from whispers, hidden memoirs, and official records. The result is a history full of horror, but also full of gaps. Gaps where the truth was too dangerous to preserve. How many stories were never written? How many victims vanished without even the dignity of memory? The silence itself is part of his legacy. In Capri's ruins, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of villas, mosaics, and walls. But the worst horrors left no trace. The children thrown into the sea were swallowed by the waves. The victims of torture left no monuments. The execution grounds were dismantled. The evidence of Tiberius's crimes was erased by time and by design. What remains is the testimony of words, fragments from historians who struggled to capture what they could barely bring themselves to describe. Modern minds struggle to understand the psychology of such a man. Some suggest madness, perhaps mental illness, paranoia fueled by alcohol, disease, or even lead poisoning. Others argue it was simply the corrupting effect of unchecked power, the truth behind Lord Acton's warning that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But perhaps the most frightening possibility is that Tiberius was not uniquely insane. Perhaps he was simply a man given the chance to indulge his worst impulses without consequence. If so, then his story is not just about him. It is about all of us, about what any human might become if stripped of restraint. This is what makes his legacy so dangerous. Tiberius did not only damage Rome, he damaged the human imagination. He proved that civilization could coexist with barbarity, that an empire could function while its heart rotted, that ordinary people could live normal lives while monstrosities unfolded in palaces above them. He revealed the fragility of morality, the ease with which fear can silence virtue, the speed with which cruelty can become normal. And yet, in the end, even Tiberius was mortal. He died despised and unloved, his body abandoned, his memory cursed. His name, once associated with Roman strength, became synonymous with depravity. In the years after his death, parents invoked him as a bogeyman, whispering his name to frighten children into obedience. Graffiti cursed him. Writers condemned him. His very memory was treated as a disease. But hatred, too, has its dangers. By setting the bar for monstrosity so high, Tiberius made later emperors seem almost moderate by comparison. A mediocre ruler could look like a blessing simply because he was not another monster from Capri. In this way, Tiberius inadvertently strengthened the imperial system. Romans, traumatized by his reign, were grateful for neglect rather than demanding good governance. He had lowered expectations so thoroughly that even cruelty seemed mild when it did not reach his extremes. The spiritual questions raised by his reign also lingered. If the gods allowed such evil to flourish, were the gods truly just? If virtue was punished and vice rewarded, what did that mean for the moral order of the universe? These questions haunted Roman thinkers, contributing to a growing spiritual crisis. It is no coincidence that in the generations after Tiberius, Rome became fertile ground for new religions and philosophies that promised answers the old gods no longer seemed to provide. Perhaps this is the final paradox of his reign. In trying to destroy the dignity of others, he inadvertently shaped the conditions for Rome's transformation. His blasphemies, his perversions, his cruelty, they all contributed to the hunger for something purer, something truer, something beyond the corruption of emperors. His evil became part of the path that would eventually lead Rome toward new spiritual horizons. But for those who lived through it, there was no such perspective. There was only fear, silence, and survival. Senators forced to condemn their friends. Parents forced to betray their children. Soldiers forced to kill innocents. A society forced to pretend that cruelty was normal. These were the realities of life under Tiberius. And though he died, the scars he carved into Rome's soul would never fully fade. Even today, nearly 2,000 years later, the name of Tiberius carries a chill. We remember him not for victories or monuments, not for laws or reforms, but for the abyss he revealed in human nature. His story is not just Rome's story, it is humanity's story, a reminder of what power can unleash when unbound by conscience. The legacy of Tiberius is not confined to the pages of history books. It lives in the cautionary whispers of every age that has come after. His reign demonstrates a truth that is as disturbing as it is undeniable, that civilization is fragile, that law and morality are thin layers stretched over the darker impulses of human nature, and that when those layers tear, the results can be catastrophic. When modern historians examine his rule, they are often struck by the sheer banality of the evil he embodied. He did not justify his cruelty with visions of empire, religion, or ideology. He did not claim to be building a new world, as some later tyrants would. He committed horrors simply because he could, because power gave him permission, because his appetites demanded it. There was no higher purpose, no twisted ideal, only the indulgence of one man's darkness. That is what makes him so haunting. Evil without reason, cruelty without cause, depravity for its own sake. These are harder to understand, harder to defend against, than crimes born of ideology or ambition. Tiberius's reign reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger is not a man with a vision, but a man with none. And yet, for all his power, he ended the same as every mortal, frail, diseased, terrified of death, and ultimately powerless against it. His body failed, his breath ceased, and his empire moved on without him. The man who once commanded the legions of Rome, who decided the fates of senators and kings, died alone, unloved and despised. No monuments were raised in his honor. No crowds wept at his funeral. His memory became a curse, a name to be spat rather than sung. But though he died, the structures he corrupted lived on. The Senate never regained its independence. The Praetorian Guard would become kingmakers, assassinating emperors and elevating others. The treason trials set a precedent that later rulers would exploit. The poison Tiberius poured into Rome did not vanish with him. It seeped into the cracks of the empire, weakening it from within. Future emperors were measured against him. Was this ruler as cruel as Tiberius? Did his excesses rival those of Capri? By comparison, even tyrants seemed moderate. Nero, Caligula, Domitian, each would shock Rome in their own ways, but the memory of Tiberius lingered as the ultimate example of corruption. He had set the standard for depravity so high that others appeared almost merciful in contrast. This, perhaps, was his final insult to Rome, that even his death served to protect the imperial system by making others seem less monstrous. The philosophers of Rome wrestled with his reign long after his passing. How could the gods allow such a man to thrive for so long? How could virtue survive when vice ruled? These questions contributed to a growing disillusionment with traditional Roman religion and ethics. The problem of evil, embodied in Tiberius, drove many to seek answers in new philosophies and faiths. The Stoics turned inward, preaching endurance in the face of tyranny. Mystery cults promised salvation in the afterlife, and Christianity, still in its infancy, offered a vision of justice and redemption beyond the corruption of emperors. In this way, Tiberius's evil shaped the spiritual path of the empire. But for all the philosophical debates, the most enduring legacy of Tiberius is the human one. The victims who suffered on Capri, the senators humiliated in Rome, the families destroyed by false accusations, the children thrown from cliffs, the mothers forced to watch, the fathers broken by guilt. These are not just stories in dusty texts. They were lives, countless lives, extinguished by one man's choices. The cruelty was not abstract. It was intimate, personal, real, and it left scars that history can never fully heal. Capri today is a place of beauty, its cliffs and waters admired by millions of tourists. Yet beneath the sunlit landscapes lies a hidden history. Every villa, every stone path, every view of the sea is haunted by what once occurred there. The same cliffs that dazzle visitors were the graves of children. The same villas that attract admiration were once prisons of horror. To walk those ruins is to walk on ground tainted by blood. And yet most visitors will never know, for history has a way of burying its darkest chapters beneath the comfort of beauty. But forgetting is dangerous. For Tiberius's story is not just about Rome. It is about the human condition. It shows us how quickly civilization can unravel, how fear can silence entire societies, how ordinary people can become complicit in monstrous systems. It reminds us that the line between order and chaos, between justice and tyranny, is thinner than we like to believe. Even in his death, Tiberius left Rome with a grim truth: that progress is not inevitable, that empires can move backward, that all the achievements of law, culture, and civilization cannot protect against the corruption of one man with unchecked power. His reign revealed that Rome's greatest strength, its centralized power under one ruler, was also its greatest weakness. For when that ruler was just, Rome flourished. But when that ruler was a monster, Rome became a nightmare. And so, 2,000 years later, his name still carries weight. He stands in history not as a conqueror, not as a builder, not as a lawgiver, but as a warning. A warning that power without conscience produces monsters. A warning that human nature contains depths of depravity as well as heights of glory. A warning that societies survive only when they refuse to tolerate evil, no matter how powerful the man who wields it. Tiberius's life ended on March 16, 37 AD, at the age of 77. Some say he was smothered by his successor's men. Others claim he died naturally, still whispering suspicions from his deathbed. But what matters is not the manner of his death. It is the legacy of his life. He inherited the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and he left it morally poisoned, politically traumatized, and spiritually wounded. The crowds in Rome who cried, "To the Tiber with Tiberius," were not simply celebrating the death of a man. They were trying to exorcise a ghost, to cleanse themselves of 23 years of fear and humiliation. But some stains cannot be washed away. Rome would recover, Rome would endure, but Rome would never forget. And neither should we. For Tiberius is not just a figure of ancient history. He is a reflection of a danger that exists in every age. The danger of unchecked authority. The danger of silence in the face of cruelty. The danger of forgetting. His reign shows us what happens when power is concentrated without restraint, when fear replaces justice, when society looks away. Perhaps the most terrifying truth is that Tiberius was not a demon, not a mythical beast, not something beyond humanity. He was a man of discipline, of talent, of intelligence, a man who had known love and loss, who had once served Rome with competence. And yet, given absolute power, he became something monstrous. The beast was always inside him, waiting for the chance to emerge. That is why his story is so important. It forces us to look not at him, but at ourselves, because the potential for cruelty does not die with one emperor. It remains in the structures we build, in the choices we make, in the silences we allow. Tiberius is long gone, but the conditions that created him, fear, ambition, unchecked power, can return at any moment in any society. His reign is not just a story from the past. It is a warning for the future. And so, as the sun sets over Capri, casting golden light over waters that once witnessed unspeakable horrors, we are left with the weight of memory. Tiberius died cursed, his name reviled, his empire enduring despite him. But the echoes of his reign still whisper across time, reminding us of the fragility of civilization, of the darkness within power, of the dangers of forgetting. Rome survived Tiberius. Humanity survived him. But the lesson remains eternal, that evil, if left unchecked, can thrive in even the greatest of civilizations, and that the only true defense is vigilance, courage, and the refusal to look away.